This is one issue where the world is living a collective trauma and which calls for global solidarity and global responses. But instead we have individual countries trying to control medicines and vaccines, using the crisis for political purposes, blaming other countries for their own failures. The US under Donald Trump is clearly one of the worst offenders, but the problem is general. So in this session, we hope to give a bit of global context to the debate. There are so many different trajectories through this crisis. We see India, Chile, Brazil, Mexico all getting worse. We see France and Germany improving rapidly. And there's a lot to be learned from comparing these different strategies and outcomes. The next slide is taken from a webinar by Geeta Gopinath, who's now the chief economist at the IMF. And the point of this slide is to emphasize how the economic impact of this crisis, the great lockdown, is much greater than the impact of the global financial crisis in 2008. And we see it as the graph on the left, and the blue is advanced economies and the red is emerging market economies. And we see everybody is in negative territory in terms of GDP growth. And the right-hand graph shows that no country is spared. And just one last little graph to show the diversity. This is also an IMF graph. This shows the percentage of GDP in announced fiscal measures. Many countries are following that strategy, but along here we see Australia and the US. The fiscal effort is less, but it's much more concentrated on tax cuts and expenditure. Down here, India comes in with a relatively small overall fiscal stimulus and a low priority to direct transfers. I'm not sure if that's completely consistent with what Sudipta Mandal told us yesterday, but these things are changing every day. So today's speakers, well, thank you all very much for joining us today. There's a great deal of expertise on different aspects of these issues, and I'm looking forward very much to hearing what you all have to say. So thank you for participating.
In our estimate, the global workforce is around 3.3 billion. And then out of that, 2 billion are engaged in the informal economy. And as you can see the screen, in our estimate, it's around 62% of the informal workers are, at the moment, very vulnerable to either lockdown measures or this lack of opportunities, and also simply because they are working in the high risk sectors, for example, service sectors. So it's quite a big number. And also that is important to actually the dimension of this crisis, especially from the perspective of young people. This is not just about the demand crisis. This is also the price shock as well. So we have dual actual disruption on both demand side and supply side. Let me explain a little bit here. First, the labor demand, as expected, is much weaker for young people because young people are concentrated on the service and other sectors which are hit by the pandemic very strongly. So but there is no actually strong the official statistics yet. So we actually undertook the global survey with around the 13,000 respondents. According to this survey, around 17% young people already say they stopped working because of pandemic. And that's not the end of the story. Those actually young people who managed to keep the job, they are now actually the working hours are declining by around the 20%, a bit more. So they have the both shock in the lack of job opportunity and also shorter hours. And at the same time, this pandemic also brought very severe disruption to education and training. We proposed the 4 policy framework, as you can see from the screen. We think it's very important to stimulate the economy using very active fiscal policies and not austerity anymore, and very accommodative policies. And also we need strong policies to support enterprise jobs and the income, basically combining the employment and the income support. Pillar 3 is, of course, it's very important to protect the workers in the workplace, especially we are now thinking of the how we can organize ourselves for the return to work at the moment, or return to office. And of course, the pillar 4 is all these policies needs to be developed on the very strong policy dialogue, especially this is very new situations. It's very important to better understand from our social partners about the situation.
There's not a single COVID-19 recession. And I think it's important for us to recognize that unlike the last few recessions which we have experienced in the world, this is not essentially a financially driven recession. Finance has undoubtedly contributed to a number of liquidity issues, and that has exacerbated and worsened the character of the recession. But the recession is, for many countries, is largely due to supply-side constraints. Supply-side constraints imposed by stay-in-shelter lockdowns and physical distancing and other precautionary requirements at the workplace. This is, I think, important for us to recognize, because although it has in turn affected aggregate demand by affecting livelihoods and incomes of the population, the fact that this is in fact quite avoidable is important for us to emphasize. In East Asia, as I emphasized, because of the effectiveness of precautionary measures, because of the early action which was undertaken, because of rapid testing, and as well as tracing and treatment, we find that it was possible to avoid stay-in-shelter lockdowns. In other words, there was no need for a lockdown of the kind which we have seen in many other countries. Already, there are very clear indications by the US authorities as well as the Japanese authorities that they will try to onshore. They will encourage their companies to onshore their investments ostensibly for strategic reasons, but also this will necessarily mean a significant reduction in trade and the possibilities for countries to produce for exports. What we are likely to see post-crisis, given what has been happening in the US and as well as in Japan, and likely responses from other authorities as well, is that there is going to be a significant reduction in the openness of the global economy in the period looking forward.
What we see around the world and what we see playing out in India, there are a lot of commonalities. So first is pre-COVID. The informal workforce faced what I've chosen to call the 3 I's, which was inequities, injustices, and indignities. And in part, or large part, this was because the dominant narratives about the informal economy are so negative. It's assumed they're somehow illegal, they're non-compliant, they're non-productive, they're a drag on the economy. You name it, there are negative stereotypes abounding about the informal economy. But there's also a point that we work on a lot, which is there's a misfit between the existing legal and policy frameworks and the reality of informal work, in large part because of the large percentage of the self-employed. What we see with COVID is, in addition to the horrific impact on the workers, which we're tracking all the time, it's exposed all the fault lines, the ravines, if you will, in labor markets, including the 3 I's of the informal workforce. So there's an opportunity to integrate the urban informal workers into urban plans, the natural markets, the street vendors, and the waste collection services. There's a huge need to extend social protection to informal workers in general, but we also need the inclusion of informal worker leaders in urban governance. So I'm glad the pillar that ILO has on social dialogue. But there are these threats of negative reversals. So in the name of protecting the public, they're being stigmatized as vectors of the virus. And there's a real threat that they'll be permanently displaced from their sites of work there'll be increased police harassment and violence, and even deeper stigmatization.
You've seen that African countries tended to move to pretty drastic lockdown policies by the end of March. So this is at the end of March, and you can see, if you look at the vertical axis, 100% is the most stringent lockdown policies, which means closure of schools, closure of workplaces, internal controls of movement, border closures, all of that. Now we know that already we've seen commodity prices falling. We've seen collapse in export markets, garments, for example, is crucial, is an important example here. Tourism. So those workers in formal self-employment, wage employment, who are in those sort of tradable sectors, would have been pretty badly affected. This is one study I just picked up, the McKinsey study, which one can argue how much reliable the study might be, but it just gives some kind of a ballpark numbers. It's talking about 9 to 18 formal jobs, 9 to 18 million formal jobs being lost, and about 100 million informal jobs being vulnerable to income loss, Sub-Saharan Africa. It does give a useful kind of a disaggregation by sector, and I think it kind of is in accord with what we might otherwise think. Much of what we've seen in Sub-Saharan Africa, and this is a summary of what we've seen in Sub-Saharan Africa, which you put together in a working paper recently, it seems to be mostly targeted formal sector workers. So paid subsidies for furloughing schemes, which some of it extended to informal workers, some subsidies for new employment training subsidies, payments to self-employed. So there's been a targeting of whatever we've seen in Sub-Saharan Africa more to the formal self-employed and the formal wage employed. And what we normally have seen in Sub-Saharan Africa is informal workers being supported by social assistance schemes, which are imperfect and really don't do their job. So there is an argument here, at least in the African case, and maybe also in the Indian case, of having urban employment programs patterned around the NREGA type programs, which are in more of the contact-intensive sectors, construction, retail, and so on, but which are the ones which are also where we see much higher proportion of lower-tier informal workers.
Regarding labor market, we have some general trends. Unemployment rates rose to 17% in April and may reach 27% in the next 2 months if trends continue. Informal works were the most affected. We have seen this in different countries in the previous presentations. But in Brazil, the National Statistics Office already shown that 70% of the 5 million dismissals between March and April are in the informal sector. So what the Brazilian government did to fight the pandemic? Basically 2 main policies. The first one is this emergency basic income and reaches around 60 million people and provides a monthly benefit of around $120 up to 3 months to each person that fulfills the requirement that is relatively generous. The threshold for eligibles is a half minimum wage per capita around $100. This program has a centralized implementation through an app from a state-owned bank and reaches around 25% of the Brazilian population today. Regarding emergency basic income, it's a very effective policy for the poor, but does not reach the new vulnerable. Although very expensive in the long run, there is evidence that the crisis is actually attenuated by payment of benefits. The second main policy, pode passar, is exclusively to formal workers, and the main goal is to avoid layoffs in the formal labor market. More than 8 million workers have made some kind of working hours and salary reduction agreements. The policy is not completely efficient in avoiding layoffs, and formal workers are never fully compensated.